Hello, everyone, and welcome to What's Wrong with the Podcast. Today, we have the great pleasure of speaking with David Staley. David is an associate professor in the Department of History at The Ohio State University, where he teaches courses in digital history and historical methods. He holds courtesy appointments in the Departments of Design, where he has taught courses in design history and design futures, and educational studies, where he has led the forum on the university. He is the author of Historical Imagination, Alternative Universities, Speculative Design for Innovation in Higher Education, Brain, Mind, and Internet, Deep History and Future, Computers, Visualizations, and History, History and Future, Using Historical Thinking to Imagine the Future. He is an Honorary Faculty Fellow in Innovation at the Center for Higher Ed Leadership and Innovative Practice at Bay Path University and was recently named a Fellow at the Center for Science and the Imagination at Arizona State University. He is host of the Voices of Excellence in the Arts and Sciences podcast and host of CreativeMornings Columbus. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our podcast. Today, we have the great pleasure of speaking with David Staley. David is an associate professor in the Department of History at Ohio State University, and he's the author of this incredible book called Alternative Universities, Speculative Design for Innovation in Higher Education. David, welcome.
Thank you, Pinar. Thank you for inviting me.
So please tell us more about yourself and your background.
I guess I'm an historian who doesn't like to stay in his lane. I've developed lots of interests over the years in addition to history, but I think I spend as much of my time thinking forward. And so in addition to being an historian, I write a lot about the future as well. I've been working on some projects over the years. I've been a practicing futurist for probably about 20 years or so. And so I'm interested in lots of different areas. I sometimes like to joke, I can't decide what I want to be when I grow up.
I love that. I think historians actually make perfect futurists, because if we don't have understanding of our past, how can we even forecast the future? So I think you're in the best lane.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. And what I tell people is historians are really good at understanding complex systems. In a sense, we study complex systems, and I think the best way to understand the future is to understand how complex systems will behave.
Yes, definitely. And we very often say that all architects and designers should have historians on their teams when they're working on projects, because really, like, how do we have an in-depth understanding of the culture and the past to propose the right project too? It's kind of understanding the future too, right?
You are preaching to the choir there. So I actually have a courtesy appointment here at Ohio State in the design department. So in fact, I'll be teaching a class this fall in design futures. And so trying to teach the next generation of designers how to be good futurists.
Amazing. Is there any way people outside of the university can join in and listen in?
Well, let's see if we can figure that out.
Okay, perfect. We're announcing this officially on this podcast. we'll just hack into your classes. But I mean, there are so many things we can talk about today, and you have done amazing work in so many different topics too. But for the sake of our 1 hour, we're going to kind of focus the conversation in higher education. Mm-hmm. And I guess my initial question would be, what are some of the issues or kind of like the reasons you saw in higher education that kind of led you to start speculating solutions?
Wow, that's so it's a complex question. I don't know if you intended it as such. I guess the ideas for the book came from many sources, many sort of rivers or tributaries. So I guess the first of these was about a decade or so ago. I was part of a team that was putting together a business plan to start a new sort of online university that we never got funding for, which is too bad. But the exercise was really fascinating for me, and it led me to start asking a question: if you were to start a university today from scratch, what would it look like? And I think that one of the things that I took away from that whole experience was that that many institutions looked like every other institution. And what I mean by that is that there's a lot of copying that goes on in higher education,
Right.
and such that in many ways, many institutions, and I understand this is a generalization because just in the United States alone, there's something on the order of about 4,000 institutions of higher learning, and then you add to that the number of institutions worldwide. But I think as a general phenomenon, there's a sense that many of them converge toward the same sort of institution.
Yeah.
And then they start to look alike. And one of the challenges that brings about is that higher education is quickly becoming a commoditized industry, meaning that there's very little differentiation between institutions, and that what you're really competing on ultimately is price. And that's true of any sort of commoditized industry. And so one of the arguments I make in the book is that there are lots of challenges facing higher education today, and I don't mean to minimize those, but that a paramount problem maybe is lack of differentiation. And so the book is as much a call for strategic imagination in thinking about what universities can be.
But that's like I mean, it's such a good point that now I'm even thinking about kind of like the accreditation system, right? That's also meant to like giving a stamp of approval to a department or an education system to basically be more like the standard. So that's like one way of losing the entire differentiation. And I guess, in developing countries, we see there's a lot of looking to West in what's happening there. So that's also a different way of copying. And I guess to your point too, when students select universities now, it's either like, is it a well-known brand? So can I like use that name in the resume, or they know a professor, or there is a program, but it's still a department or like a program within a similar system that does not always exist in other schools, but it's still a program, right? So the curriculum setup and everything is very similar. So it's never about the how I will learn, but it's more about like the branding and the details.
Well, I think you're quite correct, and I absolutely agree that at root here we're talking about branding. Now, those of us in higher education really don't like to talk about branding because that sounds too much like corporate speak and too much like business. But what I oftentimes tell my colleagues is that colleges and universities are in the reputation business. Whether you like it or not, we are in the reputation business. And building a reputation is actually a really, really difficult, challenging thing to do. And I think that at root, some of the issues around the lack of differentiation has to do with a sort of a common sort of branding. We have to be like so-and-so. We have to be like this institution. Whether you're talking about inside the United States, or indeed as you're talking about people outside the United States copying or wanting to emulate institutions in this country. But at its root is a sort of a reputation economy. Right. And that's something that I think we lose sight of in higher education.
And it's interesting how we also grow up to, and this is probably going to change, right? As you know, well, I guess there are many factors that contribute to it, and whether that is, the next generation and the generations from there, and technology, and even like the higher life expectancy we have. There are many ways like the general public might look at education differently, but we grew up really buying into that reputation business, really. Like I don't think, I mean, maybe we decide, okay, I want to study this versus this, but we didn't necessarily question how we're going to get our education. And like just buying into brands because we knew that may get us a job, right? Like there was not much in-depth thinking of like what we really want and how we really want to learn. Um, and we never even like thought of it that this was awkward because we grew up in that system. So it's interesting that um, I guess there was no motivation for the higher education industry to change too because there was no demand.
We are, and again, I'm speaking as a generalization here, but we are a very conservative institution, generally speaking. One of the root sort of philosophical questions I ask in my book is, what is the university for? What's its purpose? And it's a question that either we ask in very sort of simplistic terms, or we sort of pass that off as, well, everybody knows what a university is for. But I'm asking a more sort of fundamental, sort of existential sort of question. What are universities for? And that question is one of the things that I think undergirds every one of the speculative designs I lay out in the book. Each represents a different purpose, a different function, a different mission, whatever sort of term you want. And this is something that I've been saying to audiences, to all sorts of institutions. You should be asking yourself, what is our purpose? What is our function? And to what degree is that purpose and mission distinct? And to what degree does it make you sort of stand out from others? Or in answering the question, are you really providing a service that every other institution is providing? And you mentioned young people, younger generation. I think that one of the things, and this hasn't been entirely clear to me, frankly, Pinar, until you asked me this. I think that this is a question, even if they're not stating it explicitly, this is a question that young people are asking. What is a university for?
Right.
And we in higher education, I think, need to give that deeper thought and act upon that question much more so than we have.
Right. And you do talk about a lot about like how, this like mass online courses became so popular and we thought that might change the way like we're learning, and it didn't necessarily make that big impact, maybe like we thought that it would do, like complete shift in the industry and the way we learn. But of course, and it takes generations potentially, like the more generations are like, well, I can learn this online. And also like we now have a whole generation that like experience like 2 years of COVID,
Yes.
which like they already are like, yeah, I can do this remote and online. Like now there's actually like even more like it's more familiar to them to be able to do that at a much younger age. So for higher education, it might even be more like, yeah, obviously I can do this remote. So there is definitely, maybe it took like more than it would, but there's definitely more buy-in to just like, I can like learn a class online. Why do I need to go on campus and sit in front of a professor and listen to them? So how much of this like urgency, like, do you think that puts any urgency to a very conservative industry? Like, is there like general planning around this? Like, are there concerns of the ways that they had until now, and they really feel the need that they need to change or adapt? Or you still think like, no, like we're good?
The answer is yes and no.
Yeah.
So let me try to disentangle what I mean by this. So your observation, I think, is quite correct. That especially over the COVID year and a half, now moving into close to 2 years of COVID, many students sort of discovered that, yes, I am able to take classes remotely. I am able to take classes online. The question, and so this has been, and you allude to the fact that I talk about this in my book. This has been the challenge, the threat, the expectation, the prediction for higher education, that it's inevitable that higher education is going to become an online enterprise, like so many other industries, media industries, and higher education is a media industry in some ways. That day has been coming and predicted and predicted. And when MOOCs, the massive open online courses, started to become popular almost a decade or so ago, the feeling was, well, this is the moment now, because here's the moment now where all of higher education will be delivered online. And it's certainly true. There's an awful lot of higher education now that's delivered online. But at the same time, the prediction was, and this would completely upend all the incumbents. And that most certainly has not been the case. The incumbents are still in place.
Yeah.
And that has to do with the other side of this. So students have been telling us that, sure, I can take classes online, but I'm not certain I want to. And I had said last year, sort of in the midst of the pandemic and just before classes returned in the fall here in the United States, that I said we have to watch very carefully what students are actually saying. And what we may hear them say is, "I'm not certain I like this," or "This isn't what I'm paying my money for," and also kind of a dissatisfaction with online learning. And I think if we've learned anything in the COVID year, especially about online education, is that what has really worked, and now maybe I'm talking about my own personal experience teaching students, is that the kind of conversation that you and I are having right now over Zoom online, I did a fair amount of that kind of teaching in the COVID year. And students like that sort of one-on-one sort of mentoring. I guess we would call it sort of an Oxford tutorial. And I wonder if online education is going to become the chief conduit, the chief method, I wonder if the learning style is going to look more like an Oxford tutorial. Because one of the things that students are telling us is that the relationship, not the exchange of information, the relationship that they're developing with a professor is maybe more important to them.
Right. And with each other, right?
And with each other.
In the end, like, I think one thing that is not going to change, or maybe I'm really wrong about this, but I don't think it will change, that we're social beings. And hence the reason, yes, like work from home is also very efficient, and all sectors saw it's doable, in addition to tech industry, who has been doing it more often. But we still miss going into the office, or maybe having an ideation session or a strategy meeting, or a workshop with colleagues. And I can't even imagine, as someone who had the campus experience, not studying from a library, not hanging out with my friends, not talking to a professor at all, and everything just being in the computer. So I think there is something to having that blend of online and offline, just because, as you said, it does create access, right? And abundance of information when we also have things online. And I'm sure, and in access, I'm also meaning physical access, there are so many people with disabilities that we spoke with that were really happy about things being okay, being remote, because there was a time where they weren't even admitted to universities because they asked if they can take classes online because the campuses are not accessible. So there are definitely benefits to it too. But one thing that does not change over time as technology progresses, or when COVID happens, we're still are social animals, and we kind of need that interaction. And I totally understand, especially with prestigious schools where people are also there for not only professor interaction, but network building. There's so much more that goes into that. And you can't deliver that with online, unless we have metaverses and we're meeting in digital space. I don't know, things can really change.
Well, and yes, well, that's a whole other category, isn't it? If the nature of the online interaction, the online experience changes, that could in fact be a game changer. But you've hit upon something I think quite important, and again, something that we've learned through the COVID year, the COVID 2 years, is that, so we talked about the experience of a classroom, for instance, the face-to-face experience. But I think prior to COVID, I think we largely and especially those that were advocating for online learning. We talked about that as sort of a frill or an add-on or something that was really not essential to teaching and learning. And if the COVID year has taught us anything, that, not just is that, it's not just that a face-to-face experience is a pleasant thing, it might actually be critical to the teaching and learning. And that's, I think, something else that we are going to discover with this mass movement to online because of COVID. And now we're sort of slowly, once again, getting back into our classes. I make a distinction in my book between an educational experience that is transactional versus one that's transformational. And I am old enough that when I went to university, I assumed that it was going to be a transformational experience, that I was going to be a different person at the other end. Whether that was someone who is more knowledgeable or wiser or more mature or more cosmopolitan, whatever that was, I assumed that I was going to be transformed by education. And I think that too much higher education today is transactional, meaning I give you money, you give me skills, or you certify my skills.
Right.
And so it really is sort of transactional in that sense. And if what you're seeking in higher education is a transactional experience, then online works just fine. There are, well, I'm hard pressed to think of any examples. I'm sure they're out there, and I'm sure we're going to get all sorts of complaints when I say this, but where is the transformational online experience? And who is sort of marketing that as central to their online experience? I'm sure we will hear that. But I think that, and again, one of the things that I said in my book, and one of my aspirations, I think, with each one of my speculative designs, was that each one of those designs was intended to be transformational rather than transactional.
Yes. And let's talk about those designs, shall we? So you have 10 alternate universities here, which some, and I'm sure I'll ask more questions around the ones that were really like, oh, I wish I had that one. I'm reading, but do you want to give like a quick definition to all, or like a few? I think, maybe we can or around the themes that why you propose them.
So the subtitle of the book is Speculative Designs, and I describe these as speculative designs. And that has to do with my intention when I first started writing the book, which was to propose an alternative or an alternate university as a way to, in the way that we do speculative design, right? Which is meant to be discursive, which is meant to provoke, which is meant to get us to think about our current system and structures, even if the speculative design is never intended to be built. I think I went into this exercise with that intention in mind. And then as I wrote the book, and as I dove more into these, I realized that, more and more of these could probably be actualized.
That's actually how I was reading. Oh, these are so doable.
They are doable, and I would start to get readers like yourself say, oh, I think I'd like to attend such and such a university. And so I kept speculative design in the title, even though I think that these designs are probably more actualizable than I probably imagined. So that sort of describes the impetus. You'd like me to just start talking about some of these in turn?
Yeah.
So let me give you an example of one. It's called Nomad University. And it's the idea that the university has no physical location or a single physical location. And so a viewer to this interview might say, well, you're just talking about online experience. And in fact, what I'm talking about is moving the location of the university around the globe. And so it's based on a model of a university experience as a series of gap years, or say 6 to 8 gap year experiences, in the way that young people before they attend university will take a year off and have some sort of experience, usually not in every case, but usually what that means is sort of going off somewhere in the world and engaging in some sort of meaningful project. And there's been all sorts of interesting research to suggest that those students come to university better prepared, more mature, their outcomes tend to be better. And so I took from that, well, what if instead of being a sort of a pre-university experience, what if it became the university experience?
Yeah.
And you go around the world, say every 6 months or so, you would go and experience different kinds of, well, activities, experiences. You build irrigation systems in sub-Saharan Africa. You engage in community policing in Baltimore. You go to Oxford, Mississippi, and read Faulkner for 6 months. But the idea is to create or is to produce, again, a sort of a transformational experience. A student is not just simply learning skills, but is also traveling the world and becoming, or at least giving the opportunity to be cosmopolitan. And so there's not a lab, there's not a university building, or the university building is, well, wherever you happen to be in the world.
That's so fascinating. And what I'm thinking about is like, and this is not even a conversation. It depends from country to country. I think in the United States, I do come across people who take a year off and then go to college. But for example, I grew up in Turkey, and there, if you're a good student, like you're like treated like a racehorse, right? Like, okay, now you go into college, and what is your graduate experience after this? Like, there's no break. You like get all the degrees that you can, and then you get like aim for the best job. Like that's kind of, and maybe it comes from like a survival instinct when you're in a developing country and there's more concern about the future than let me get everything today. Maybe that's like kind of the baggage we have like going into this. But I often, as someone who went into graduate right after undergraduate, what I saw was like after I started working after graduate school, I was like, I really did not understand why I was taking all these classes. Like I had no idea. And maybe like 4 years into my like work life, I would be like, oh, this is why I took that class, and there's like such later appreciation to what I was learning at the time. And what you're describing to me is like almost you not only acquire the skills as you go, but you also found your interest, what you want to learn better. Maybe the Nomad University has like elective classes that are so much more flexible because of that, and such a more purposeful and self-curated education in that sense too, because you just know yourself better, and therefore you know what you want to learn better. And also just like, world exposure is like one of the biggest educations a person can get anyway.
Absolutely.
So.
Yes. And in phrasing it the way you have, Pinar, one of the themes that sort of runs throughout many of the alternative universities is that I play around with graduation requirements and especially subjects and disciplines. So in the Nomad University, for instance, a student doesn't major in a discipline.
Yeah.
You develop a set of skills going around the world, and so you develop, I guess, a sort of a portfolio of skills. There's another university model that I call the new liberal arts college. And rather than based on subjects, history, philosophy, English, or languages, the disciplines are based around skills. In fact, 7 skills, including things like leadership and communications. In fact, what I did is I looked at surveys from employers that say, here are the skills that we want to see from employees. And so what if we built a school, a college, around those skills? Instead of what we do now, which is to say, well, you major in philosophy and you learn communication. So what if we reoriented the university around not disciplines and subjects, but skills? There's another one, in fact, one of my favorite universities in the book is what I call Polymath University.
Oh, yes.
You like this one?
Yes, one of my favorites too, yeah.
So, well, for the viewers, let me just quickly describe it. So, at this university, so the disciplines, the traditional disciplines, are there and established. Any student, as a condition of graduation, triple majors in 3 very different disciplines. In fact, I've got a scheme in the book. But you essentially, so instead of majoring, say, in history and English philosophy, or business, finance, and accounting, a student would major in philosophy, finance, and dance.
I love it so much. Maybe because also my like personal, like always maybe like regret, like in, again, like going back to countries, sort of like if you are, you know, a good student, you're expected to study like a certain programs in
Right.
school, right? And the perception is, oh, if you study any of other of these, you won't get a job. So like I studied industrial engineering, but always had huge interest in psychology. And so when I was reading this, I was like, oh my God, I could have still done engineering and music because I also just, you know, love everything about music, and then psychology. Like I could have mixed this up like so well. So I definitely, yeah, that's why it was one of my personal favorites.
And I'm absolutely delighted and very pleased to hear that. But you know, I think you've hit upon another important point in this, is the sort of the expectations for society, and I want to say society rather than say the workforce or the workplace.
True.
Although that's a big part of it. There are expectations about what a graduate needs to have. And I think that, and I don't know how much I address this in the book, I think for any one of these universities to be created, instituted, started up tomorrow, we would also have to sort of alter the demand side of the equation.
Yeah.
So take Polymath University. So one could argue that, well, you're not really specialized in anything, and so maybe that doesn't make you employable. To which I would say, I would want to go to employers and say, wouldn't you want to hire a person with this sort of cognitive flexibility? That this is a desirable person to have in your organization, not because they fit in within some predetermined silo, but that they have this sort of breadth of knowledge and understanding. That's the sort of person you should be looking for your company. And so I think it's as much changing attitudes about society that's an important part of making each one of these speculative designs actionable.
So true, because how it was like branded then, maybe a little less now, as there is definitely, again, what we were talking about, generational change and more interest in the portfolio than like the GRE scores or whatnot. But like it was considered to be like, oh, you're jack of all trades, like master of none, right?
Yes.
So, which also to that, like, who really is master of anything when we're graduating from college these days, right? Like, we don't even know why we're taking the classes. So I think, yeah, definitely. And I do want to highlight a few more that I really loved, and want to like sort of go into a little bit more in depth with that. First, like, let's talk about advanced play, like how genius of an idea that is. Can you elaborate on that more?
So what if we created a university whose ultimate purpose wasn't knowledge, whether the acquisition or even the creation of knowledge, but play as the highest, as its highest calling, as its highest goal? And so the university is a kind of playground. And I suppose whether or not you like this idea, and Pinar, you clearly do, has to do with your attitude toward play. I think in too much of American society, at least, I can't speak necessarily for other cultures, but I think in American society, we tend to denigrate play, either as childish or something that children engage in, but not serious people don't engage in play. And frankly, maybe not even children as much anymore. There's all sorts of unfortunate research that suggests that the amount of time that children engage in sort of unstructured play, which is very different from after you're done with school, go to violin lessons, and then here's soccer practice, and then there's dance practice, which is that's different from play.
Yeah.
And so the amount of time given over to play actually seems to be getting smaller and smaller, at least among American children. This would be an institution whose purpose is to allow people to engage in play, and there are all sorts of sort of definitions, but oftentimes play involves sort of appropriation and divergent uses for objects. It means pretend. It means experimentation. And it also implies sort of engaging in some activity just for the joy of it and not because it fulfills some sort of function.
Yeah.
So you'll sometimes hear scientists and others talk about the experiments they might run as a kind of play. Those of us who are designers, I think we play rather a lot. We play with a material. Again, there's not an outcome in mind. We just, we see something and we want to engage it in some way. This would be a very, very radical institution if we were to start it today, not just simply because of the associations we have about play, but that it would be very difficult to manage.
Yeah.
Play is not something that gives itself over to sort of bureaucratic management, because right now in universities, we want to know outcomes. What are the outcomes, the learning objectives of such a class? And play, I think, unstructured play of the kind we've been describing, does not lend itself to that kind of quantification and metrics.
Yeah.
And so in some ways, it would be the most radical of my designs, I think, that I've proposed here.
Radical, but at the same time, I think it's one of the examples where it's easier to maybe create as an intervention or hack into existing universities. So like to your point, and as designers, definitely like so much of the design process is very unstructured. Like with my industrial engineering and finance background, I tried to structure the design team all the time and I never accomplished it. It seems very messy. People might look like they're not working, but they're actually thinking, they're playing with something, and like it's chaotic. And from that, then you achieve a great outcome. And I think, what we call like the maker labs,
Yes.
are kind of the adult version of sort of the playground, right? Just with more technological widgets and whatnot. But that the University of Advanced Play gave me the idea of like, well, how can a maker lab be more of a playground, actually? And there are, what is interesting to me too was, this is not an uncommon conversation in early childhood development, right? Like there are so many people like Waldorf and Montessori that sort of talked about the importance of play and learning. So what made us think suddenly when we were 18 or 20 years old, and given that like expected life longevity is like 100 plus now, what made us think that was okay for like the first 6 years of our lives? And when you're 20, oh no, like we don't learn by play. So where did that gap happen? So it made me think of like a few things of, like how can this actually be a design intervention today? But also, when did we disconnect? Like when did we think play is not okay? And I don't know if you have like any like hypotheses around this, but I'm sure you do.
It would be a hypothesis. I don't know if I could prove it, but I think that one cause, not the only cause, might be disciplining knowledge. And the idea of discipline, I guess, we call something a discipline, or in gymnastics or figure skating, we talk about disciplines.
Yeah.
And what that means is sort of putting restrictions, putting restraints around certain kinds of behavior.
Yeah.
And I think that might in part explain why it just doesn't occur to us in higher education that we should be engaged in play. And as you say, Pinar, it's something, well, sure, that's fine for elementary school children, but we're engaged in serious work here, and play is not serious. And I think that maybe is another sort of large causal reason here, is that we assume that play is not something that serious people engage in. That attitude, I know, is changing. There's a serious play movement that's been going on for a few decades now. The Lego people have been very good, I think, at not just simply selling those wonderful blocks, and they are wonderful, but also providing opportunities for organizations to play.
Yeah.
And I talk in the book as what Lego are doing is sort of maybe emblematic of what an institute for advanced play might look like.
That's so amazing. Another one I really want to talk about, because I thought it was actually very feasible to do today, and I would love to get your thoughts on that, are micro colleges. Another one that I really want to talk about, because I thought it was actually very doable today, are micro colleges. And I would love to get your thoughts around it further. And so why not, like, maybe let's give a definition of what micro colleges are, and then we can discuss further.
So you're correct to characterize them as micro colleges, plural, because there's more than one. In fact, there's probably thousands of them. So a micro college is defined as one faculty and 20 students. And that's the college, not a class. It is a college, which sounds, I'm sure there'll be some viewers that'll say, well, that sounds ridiculous. But in fact, there is a college in existence today in the United States that looks something like that. It's called Deep Springs College in California, in the Sierra Nevada mountain range of California. And so the idea here, and I can talk about sort of how you would sort of logistically make that work, but the idea in some ways is a very ancient one, of a single teacher or mentor working with a small number of students. The system of gurus in India before the arrival of the British, it would have been very common for a school to have been just one teacher and about 24 or so pupils. And so in some ways, the idea of a micro college is a very ancient one, a very old one. And I also think one that has a lot of appeal. And I write, and I'm not dismissing large universities. I teach at a large university. But it's based on the idea that there's something about a smaller scale that is educationally and pedagogically maybe more effective than a large scale university. One of the more proximate ideas that got me to think about a micro college is the so-called micro school movement that we're seeing in K-12 learning. And those micro schools are actually quite bigger than what I am imagining for a micro college, but we're talking about schools on the order of about 150 pupils. And some of this is based on the so-called Dunbar number, Robin Dunbar's number, that the number of really effective relationships that any one person can have is probably no more than 150. And so that's where some of the creators of micro schools are getting that idea. So, and again, I mentioned the idea of an Oxford tutorial early on in this interview. In some ways, a micro college would be based on that, the kind of the scale and intimacy of an Oxford tutorial as a way of thinking about the organization of a college.
Yeah. And the reason why I thought, like, in so many ways this is also doable today is, well, first of all, this is kind of like how we start out our education, right? Like, I remember until maybe like third grade, we had like one teacher and we were learning everything through that teacher. And also that teacher might bring in other teachers for specific classes. But you are actually cultivating a relationship with only one person. Also, I, like, growing up, like, the classes I took were like, we were always from like 15 to 20 students in one class. And only when I got to college, suddenly it was 60 plus, which is still considered small. I mean, there are like massive auditoriums with hundreds of students. And like, the bigger the classroom gets, the more you disengage from what there's just a lot happening. And it's like almost like watching a concert. Like, since there's like no interaction, right? Like, you're just like the taker of what's going on. If you can keep your attention for like 3-4+ hours that happen in like classes in colleges or graduate schools. And so to me, micro colleges were like, first of all, I could sort of like visualize how that might look like. Like, I imagined a campus to be not one college, but several colleges maybe that could also benefit from each other, right? So you could actually maybe like for a day, like swap professors on like a topic, or if so the students at one college would really want to learn about something, you can actually go to your neighbor and ask if they have anything on that, right? Like, I imagine like a city of colleges almost that kind of benefit from each other, but by being also independent from each other, students who elect those colleges sort of like curate their own curriculum, which sort of ties into all the like student-based learning theories that are getting more popular, I guess, these days, but not necessarily in higher education really, but earlier education.
So one of the teaching methods of a micro college would be peer-to-peer learning. But in describing your vision there, Pinar, in some ways, what we're talking about looks very much like the Oxbridge universities, which are a collection of constituent colleges. I'm talking about colleges that would be much smaller than one at either Oxford or Cambridge. The other thing that I suggest in the book is that a micro college could be located anywhere. And so I'm imagining, for instance, a micro college at an architecture firm or a design studio, or a micro college at an art museum, or a micro college on a farm. In other words, the setting we'd be limited only by our imagination. But in a city especially, this is why I say that it would have to be many micro colleges, plural micro colleges. In a city of any size, I would expect to see hundreds of micro colleges dotted throughout the landscape.
Oh, it's so fascinating. It just inspires us now. Like, if we start a Sauer University, we're gonna give the credit to you. And it will start in our firm, as you suggested. So, I mean, this is all very fascinating. I think I can talk about, all your speculations for a day, but we do need to slowly wrap up. So I do recommend everyone getting this book and reading it. And before we wrap up, I do want to ask someone who's putting forward speculative ideas and designs out there, anybody who wants to kind of change the system there within, or make progress, or push boundaries, either being inspired by your designs or in another discipline or industry, what would be your advice to them?
To practice the responsibility of imagination.
I love that.
So, and to be clear about that, I think that anyone who is contemplating the future, anyone who's thinking about making positive change today, maybe one of our most important attributes as humans is our imagination. And I would urge anyone who's watching this to take that responsibility very seriously.
I love that so much. I wish somebody also told me that like maybe 10 years ago. But thank you so much, David. This was so fascinating. Any news or updates or other upcoming books that we should be aware about that you also want to share with the audience?
I'm working on a book right now with a co-author that's tentatively titled A College in Any Town. And it's an argument for why any town of any size needs a college or university, especially if they want to connect to the knowledge economy.
Well, anything that, I guess, like a quick thing that comes into your mind, what can we do with the spaces?
I did a series of presentations here earlier this year with an architect with IBI Group. She's actually located in Toronto. And that was the subject of our presentations. It was taking some of my speculative design ideas and then thinking through what does that mean sort of spatially? How do we give spatial form to what are conceptual designs? And so that's the conversation we can have, the way in which we could be designing spaces to induce each one of these speculative designs.
Yeah, perfect. Amazing. And I think it ties into so much on everything being local and like circular economy and whatnot. So we will very much look forward to that. Thank you so much, David. This was such a treat. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Pinar.
And that is this week's episode of What's Wrong with the Podcast. To make sure you never miss an episode, subscribe to our show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any other podcasting platform. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel. Links can be found in the episode description, and you can also find them on our website, podcast.what'swrongwith.xyz. If you found value in the show, we would appreciate if you could rate us and leave a review, or you can simply tell your friends about us. For more details on our guests, follow us on Instagram and Twitter. Don't forget to join us next week. Thank you for listening.